A Hot Day in Summer, Part 4. Written and read for you by SirTenTales. The next day, Emmett and Cherry met at their usual place, at their cars, on the top floor of the parking deck, a few spots away from each other. Their classes had finished for the day, and they had plenty of time to plan a project before build time in the shop. The set had to go up on the stage today, so they couldn't skip it. The last show of the semester was coming up. Then again, they also had finals coming up since it was coming close to the end of the semester. So maybe this wasn't the best time to start a new project with very little experience in what they were actually doing. But Emmett saw the grin on Cherry's face as she sketched in her sketchbook and thought the extra late nights and extra work were worth it. They sat in the back of Emmett's Jeep with the door open, relishing in the breeze on the hot afternoon. Of all the places to meet, this was possibly Emmett's favorite. It was on top of a hot, empty parking deck, but it was quiet and all theirs for most of the day. Cherry with her sketchbook and Emmett with his laptop. He was showing her what he had found so far for their dragon puppet build. He was up half the night scouring web pages, watching videos, and reading blogs. He had folders filled with pictures and tutorials and notes. He guessed from her sketchbook filled with loose pages and notes and fabric and paint swatches that she had done the same. Leave it to the two of them to be on similar wavelengths. We talked about the dragon being on your shoulder, so really just the head and tail need to articulate, she mused as she flipped through her sketchbook. Then we can do a kind of hand puppet, with my hand in the head. I looked into the mechanisms that use just a cable to control the whole puppet, and it might be more complicated than we can handle on the first build. True. I would like to still like the project when it's done, she said, jotting down notes in her sketchbook. Then, if we do the hand puppet route, it should be pretty small. Emmett looked at her puzzled. Yeah, he said slowly. How big were you thinking the puppet was going to be? He asked. Oh, maybe like 4 feet, Cherry said without looking up from her writing. 4 feet! Emmett exclaimed. On a first build, I'll only be 2 heads taller than it. Yeah, I was thinking it could ride on your back. It would be pretty impressive, Cherry explained excitedly. Clearly, she had bigger plans than Emmett planned for. He wasn't surprised, though. Cherry was the go big or go home type. He was the one that had to talk her out of a giant willow tree growing out of the middle of the stage for a production of The Giving Tree. She explained that obviously they wouldn't plant a real tree. They would just build one. Although Emmett really liked the idea and knew how they could execute it, he knew it would take a year to complete and they only had 5 weeks. But I still need to play in the LARP, and the dragon may become a hindrance of much of any abilities, especially if I'm controlling the head with my hand, he explained, hoping this wouldn't dampen her spirits. Cherry looked up at the sky thoughtfully, considering what Emmett said. You're right. And it would get much too hot if you have to carry it around all day. You could overheat, and we don't want that. It should be smaller. She turned to a fresh page in her sketchbook and began sketching. Oh, that makes a lot more room for design elements, though. If we're not having to contend with size, she said. Emmett typed notes on his laptop, glad that Cherry was undeterred. Cherry hardly ever let anything spoil her fun. They did end up building that tree in the middle of the stage for the production. It was just a bit more artistic in interpretation than realistic. Isn't this more of a umbrella than a tree? Moby had said. Cherry took one look at the creation and walked back into the shop. She came back with a box of faux leaves and handed some to Emmett and Moby. It just needs finishing touches, she said. The leaves just need to be attached. Clyde came out of the shop and handed each of them a staple gun. He and Cherry started attaching the leaves to the umbrella to make it more of a tree. Oh, Moby and Emmett exclaimed and followed Clyde and Cherry's lead. Cherry and Emmett continued their brainstorming session, sketching and searching until they had a pretty good plan of how to build their puppet. A hand puppet that was essentially Emmett's whole arm. It would rest on his shoulder and have a long tail that would trail behind Emmett's back. Emmett even planned on adding a pocket in it so it could function as a small pouch. "Almost like a kangaroo!" Cherry exclaimed. It was not as arduous as they thought when they started planning, though they both agreed that they needed to spend a lot of time on it. Cherry proposed they would finish it before the semester ended so that Emmett could have it for his next event in the summer. Cherry raised her head from her sketchbook and looked at Emmett. "Question, though. Where are we going to work on this?" Emmett raised his head from his laptop and looked back at Cherry. They hadn't thought of this. They certainly couldn't work at either of their homes. Cherry often told Emmett that she never really told her parents anything. She only told them what they absolutely needed to know, lest she get the judgmental third degree. Emmett leaned a similar way with his parents, though they always seemed to find out what he was doing without him telling them. "I think if we're strategic, there are plenty of places on campus we can use," Emmett said slowly, thinking out this possibility as he said it. Cherry looked at him thoughtfully and smiled. "Yeah, that could definitely work." The next day, during the long break they had, Emmett and Cherry made their way to the nearest thrift store. "So which 2 points of the triangle are we going for?" Cherry asked as they walked through the densely packed store. "Cheap and good," Emmett replied. He was particularly engrossed in a gaudy purple dress that was covered in sequins. Easy dragon skills, he thought. They couldn't spend too much money on this project, but there's a lot you can do when you are creative. "Oh, look! Foam cushions! These could work for the structure," Cherry called from the next aisle. "Actually, Cherry, have you given any thought to your LARP character? I know we were working on a piece of mine, but we should have a solid idea of yours, too," Emmett called over his shoulder. The idea popped into his mind as he was searching for material. It was easy for him to do other tasks while focusing on something. An actual multitasker. When he didn't hear Cherry answer, he called her name. "Cherry?" "Yeah, I have." Cherry popped up like a meerkat nearly right behind him. Emmett started and clutched his chest, turning to face her. Cherry smiled mischievously at him. "Okay. "Wanna tell me?" Emmett said, trying to catch his breath. He could make a joke about her leaving him breathless, but he decided to keep it to himself. Cherry shifted the cushion and clothing she was holding and thought. And thought. And thought. Eyebrows furrowed and eyes closed. She opened her eyes again and said, "I have an idea, but I don't want you to laugh." "Why would I laugh?" He was a little taken aback by this. "I don't know. It just sounds stupid," she said. "I promise you I won't." "Okay." Cherry went on a long explanation of her character. She put down the items she was holding to illustrate with her hands, possibly to explain the backstory, or maybe the costume. And at one point she picked up a butter knife from a 10-cent bin and started brandishing it like a sword. She walked up and down the aisles, rehashing ideas until she finally came to a stop in front of Emmett. He couldn't help it. A very small chuckle escaped him. He slammed his hand over his mouth. "See? I knew you would laugh." "I'm not laughing." He wasn't. He was really impressed. Most first-time players don't have a fully fleshed-out reality for the character, and hearing Cherry talk about hers, even explaining backstory and preferences to food, impressed him. It made him positively gleeful. He was so excited for her that he wanted to burst out loud and cheer for her. But he tempered that excitement as he normally did, out of reflex, and it came out as a chuckle instead. Cherry laughed then. "Well, I'm not changing her. So, is she good or not?" she said finally. "I think she sounds wonderful. I'd happily fight beside her," Emmett answered. She beamed at him. Heat rose in his face and he struggled to keep talking. "So, what else do we need?" he said in a hurry. "I think we have everything," Cherry said as she picked up her spoils. "Let's go summon a dragon." She turned on her heel and walked to the checkout counter. Emmett smiled to himself and followed. As the days passed, Emmett and Cherry were thick as thieves. Every chance they got, they worked on their project, patterning, cutting, and foam shaping, all the while talking about everything. Emmett loved how easy it was to be with Cherry. Even after they were finished working for the night, they just sat and talked for an hour or so, much to the grievance of their parents. But every time, they played it as schoolwork. What with the puppet project, the build crew, coursework, and everything in between, they might as well sleep in their cars. It wasn't as if they would have minded. A week later, they actually started the more solid details like the rod, eyes, and spikes on the spine. They were in the theater shop, with permission from the advisor, of course. Thankfully, the set they were working on was already built on the stage, so they wouldn't be tampering with anything from the show. With all the glue and blades at their disposal, carving and sculpting was a lot easier. They could shape the head better. At one point after build time, Justin poked his head into the shop just to check in, Ruby right behind him, leaning around the door as well. They didn't say anything, only looked at each other and smiled as they left the two makers alone. The library study room was where they finally managed to cover the pieces in fabric. Cherry had brought her sewing box and was hand-sewing the skin and scales to the pieces while Emmett cut the fabric out. "This is so much easier to do when someone else is cutting the pieces for me. My hands are already so tired from cutting that I almost gave up on sewing," Cherry said, knotting off a thread and moving to the other side of the arm of the dragon. "How come you didn't bring your machine?" Emmett asked, still focused on cutting the leg part out. "A bit cumbersome. I keep forgetting it anyway. I should probably find a place to hide it here." Days went on. The puppet was steadily coming together. The set for the last show of the year was nearly finished. Cherry's hair changed again, though subtly this time. "I wanted a more bohemian look, so I just got new braids and made them look distressed," she explained to Emmett after finishing puppet work for the night. Emmett looked at her. He liked everything she did to her hair, so he didn't mind it either way. But he still said, "It sounds like you don't like it." "Well, I like it," she said emphatically. That's all she had to say. Emmett understood. She liked it. Her mom didn't. "I like it too," he agreed. She grinned and sat back against the wall next to Emmett. "I thought you would," she said under her breath. It had been weeks of the puppet project of preferable pain, Cherry called it. They ended up in the commuter lounge this time, their favorite workspace. It was quiet and empty at night. No commuters ever stayed in the commuter lounge after dark. They drove home. They were alone there, and all they could hear was the vending machine whirring on the other side of the room. It was that weird, wonderful time of night. It was early enough for people to still be awake, but late enough for them to be talking in hushed voices in secluded corners. Cherry and Emmett had been working on their pet puppet for hours. They had finally made it to the home stretch of their project. The body was nearly all together, and if they pushed, they could finish it by tonight. But they were also so tired that anything else they worked on could result in a mistake or two. So they sat on the floor against the divider that separated the TV lounge from the cafe table lounge, absent-mindedly watching the weird infomercials go by or staring into space. In this space, they fell into their normal rhythm of talking about anything and everything, anything that was on their minds. It was so easy for them to fall into this rhythm, Emmett thought. He didn't want this time to end. If he could make this time stand still right here, he would. "So, what are your plans this summer again?" Cherry asked. "Same as always," Emmett answered. Nothing much, they said together. They laughed. Well, except for that one LARP event in the summer and all the prep work for the LARPs in the fall, she said. Yeah, or all the project planning for the year, right? He countered. Yeah. They both knew they couldn't do anything too crazy when home for the summer, so they kept their interest and hobbies in hibernation until the next term began. Well, you know what we could do? Cherry asked. Emmett turned his attention from the TV and looked at her. They were sitting so close to each other. Their shoulders touched. Emmett was hyper-aware of this and kept himself as still as a statue. We did so well with Operation Puppet Master that maybe we could keep going throughout the summer? She said, a smile playing on her face. I'd be down for that. But how do you suppose we'd get around our parents? I have the perfect plan. We tell them we need to take summer classes. Emmett made a face. Cherry lifted a hand in the air, anticipating his answer. Hear me out. We just need to tell them that in order to graduate on time, we need to take summer courses so that we can get our credits in, she said confidently. They'll buy it hook, line, and sinker. Emmett had a feeling Cherry had been planning this for a while, and he adored this plan. We really need to sell it, so we should take at least one class so we actually have proof we're going to classes. If it meant more time with Cherry, he'd happily try out pre-med classes to please his parents, just so he could see her. We could even start a new project and not have such a heavy course load to work around, he said thoughtfully. Exactly! And I would get to see you in the summer, Cherry exclaimed. She looked at him warmly and added softly, I hate when I don't get to see you. Emmett stared back at her, his breath catching. I hate when I have to be away from you, he said without hesitation. At that moment, everything stopped. Emmett felt heat rising to his ears. Cherry's breath caught in her throat. The room was so quiet now. When did they move so close to each other? Cherry could feel Emmett's breath. Emmett's eyes couldn't focus anymore. Their lips were so close to touching. Suddenly, a loud noise sounded in their ears. They pulled back from each other and looked up. The blaring noise and lights of the fire alarm were going off. Emmett looked at Cherry, who was breathing hard. He just realized he was doing the same. He shook his head and stood up. Offering his hands to Cherry, he pulled her up. Without a word, they walked out of the lounge and followed the small array of students that emerged from other parts of the building, slowly making their way outside. There should be more urgency, but it was the middle of the night on a college campus. Most likely, some of the students were asleep in the cafeteria on their laptops and were woken up from their nice dream. At least, that's what Emmett felt like. They stood a few yards away on the green, watching the building for signs of fire. Emmett just realized he was still holding Cherry's hand. Her other hand was gripping his arm as she stood close to him. So close to him. She was shaking, he thought. Or was he the one who was shaking? 5 or so minutes passed when a fire engine pulled up. The students watched as the men and women in heavy gear entered the building. Oh, shit, Cherry said in a small voice. What? What's wrong? Emmett whispered. A look of fear crossed Cherry's face as she looked at him. The puppet, she whispered back. Their many hours of hard work was still sitting in the lounge right now. Emmett took a step forward. There was no way he was letting Cherry's work be burned and lost forever. He felt her hand tighten in his. Don't you dare, she said, her voice frantic and forceful. He stepped back, all the while keeping his eyes on her. A loud voice caught their attention. All right, kids, you can go back in, one of the firefighters announced. He strode up to the students with the night desk manager next to him. Take a guess. It was burning popcorn in the microwave, the tired worker said. I swear I've had it up to here with you kids, the worker mumbled as she walked away with the firefighter, probably to clean up the mess this might have caused. The students filed back into the building, grumbling and chatting the whole way. When Emmett and Cherry got back to the lounge, their hands finally reluctantly released. Emmett started closing paint bottles and unplugging glue guns, while Cherry picked up fabric and foam from the floor. They didn't speak or look at each other. When they had finally finished cleaning up, Emmett rose and turned to Cherry. "Cherry, I can finish the puppet at home and then have it to you before the end of the semester," Cherry said quickly. "What?" Emmett said, dumbfounded. He couldn't understand where this abrupt statement came from. She was looking at him, face unreadable, hand clutching her braid. "I don't mind. There's a lot to do before the end of the semester, and I don't want to keep you from papers and stuff I know you have to do," she said in a hurry, trailing off as she picked up her bags. "Cherry, you don't," Emmett sputtered, not knowing what to say. Before he could say anything else, she walked toward the door of the lounge. "Cherry, wait." "I'll see you later," she called over her shoulder. And then she was gone. Emmett stood there, staring at the door. He couldn't move for a few minutes. He felt like the merry-go-round he was riding came to a sudden halt. He shook himself out of his stupor and followed Cherry. When he got to the front stoop of the building, he saw how far she had gotten. She was nearly at the parking deck already, walking at a fast pace with her head lowered. A pang of sadness shot through Emmett's heart as he watched her go. He couldn't believe what just happened. He felt like it was all a dream. Cherry was so close. Cherry, the girl he thought of all the time and couldn't stop thinking of. The girl who was the bright, shining light in his life. The girl he was unabashedly and unconditionally in love with. Had tried to get away from him so fast, after he was so sure that she felt the same way. He went back inside to grab his backpack and what supplies were left. He pulled out a pen from the backpack and put it between his teeth and started chewing. He thought he had kicked this habit after high school, but nerves and worry got the better of him. Emmett didn't know what to do. More than anything, he wanted to run after Cherry and find out what was going on in her head. But the way she left just now made him think that she wanted to be left alone. Was it her parents? Was it work? Was it him? If it was the former two, he would do everything he could to help her. If it was the last one, he would leave her be and stay out of her life like a respectable man should, even if the latter would crush him. One thing Emmett was certain of, he wouldn't know what was bothering Cherry until he saw her again.